Alright, so today I'm going to talk to you about Supabase and how it's basically just Postgres and a few APIs. So, who am I? My name is Lucas. I'm currently a senior product engineer at Papercut. In the past, I've worked for a number of companies and industries, ranging from government to startups and everything in between. During these roles, I've had the pleasure and displeasure of working with a number of databases and backends as a service. Most recently, I've done extensive work with Firebase, and, well, it's been fun. So let's talk about you. Has anyone here used a backend as a service or even a proprietary database like DynamoDB? I'm fairly certain most of us have. And who here has considered moving off of that backend as a service or proprietary database due to annoying limitations and lack of documentation? So often we find ourselves using these for development velocity or because they're just really tightly integrated with the platform offering we're using. And we end up building moderate applications that then start running into these limitations or bottlenecks or anything else. But because we've spent all that time and development effort and migration options are limited, we often feel locked and trapped, or at least I know I have, and the companies I've worked for have. So that brings me to the next point. What is Supabase and why is it great? So, Supabase is an open source backend as a service that provides us developers with an easy to use interface that communicates with Postgres. Because it's built on Postgres, which is an open source database that most of us have probably used, we get a familiar syntax, a standard structure, and there's less proprietary tools or languages that we need to learn to interact with our backend as a service. So, what could you do with Supabase? Well, for starters, it's built on top of Postgres, so you can do all the typical things you would normally do with a database. This means that, like, if you're a bit boring, you could just use it as a hosted database with niceties like PG Bouncer for connection pooling, because those are very expensive in Postgres, as we may or may not know. Likewise, Supabase comes with a vast library of Postgres extensions that let you do fun things. You could use the PG Vector extension to store OpenAI embeddings for natural language similarity search, or you could use things like PG cron for scheduling cron jobs. Once you get a feel for that, you could start using the Supabase SDKs and APIs for some more exciting use cases. Once you do get into those exciting use cases, you could use things like the Authentication API, which will let you authenticate with a range of third party and social providers. Likewise, the Storage API gives you a Postgres backed blob storage, similar to S3, but not quite. The Real Time API lets you add real time features to your application without needing a backend, so you don't have to worry about WebSockets or connection retries or anything like that. You can also leverage things like foreign data wrappers, which are native to Postgres, and they let you do things like interact with Stripe as if it were a table in your database. So instead of fetching a user and then going to Stripe, you could just simply join on your foreign data wrapper. It's pretty awesome. So let's talk about vendor lock-in. Vendor lock-in is obviously a scary reality for most of us, and it's something that we quite often talk about when we're working at companies. Many people want to be multi-cloud or multi-vendor so they can avoid it. That way they feel as though they still have some power in the relationship. Unfortunately, most of the time this doesn't work out. With few options for customization and with migration costs, it can be very scary, both in terms of developer time and just infrastructure time. Most of us end up feeling trapped. So, Supabase comes in as an open source solution that gives us the flexibility that we need. We can own our data and reduce our risk of vendor lock in. Because it's built on top of Postgres and open APIs, if we really needed to, we could also move off Supabase and start self-hosting it as we slowly migrate pieces off the APIs, or even just continue using it on our desired platform. So let's actually understand Supabase's architecture. As we've said a number of times now, it primarily runs on top of Postgres, with Dino deploy being used for edge functions, which are totally optional. It provides a gateway on top of Postgres that powers the client SDKs and those APIs that we were talking about. And within Postgres itself, we have a standard library that has been written by Supabase. It comes in the form of an extension, and it lets you do cool things like validate incoming JWTs for row level security and more. So, as we can see here, it's a diagram of the Supabase architecture. Our large chunk down the bottom is Postgres, as we expect. And then we have a number of services that sit on top of this Kong API. For those that don't know, Kong is just an API gateway, and it will help tie all this in together. So, how could Supabase help you on a new project today? Well, for starters, it is a quick and easy hosting solution for your database. It includes industry best practices and security, and it's usually much cheaper than the alternatives, with their free tier being very generous. Likewise, once you start using it, you can do things like add real-time or multiplayer functionality to your application really quickly without sacrificing security or dealing with any of the troublesome development time. You can implement a robust access model for your database using row-level security. That then means that you don't actually need to write all the boring CRUD backend endpoints because you can just do it in your front-end application without any worries. And finally, you could launch your application with multiple authentication providers on day one without any pain or tears. So often we have to hide things like Google Auth or Twitter Auth because it's just annoying to implement. It has gotten better recently with things like Nextauth or Auth.js, but it's still somewhat painful. So how could Supabase help you on an existing project? So you like what you've heard, you wouldn't mind integrating it, but you already have a pretty hefty application written. So if you're already on Postgres, you could simply use pgdump to dump your current database and migrate it to Supabase. Then you could adopt the backend as a service features at a pace that suits you, while you still benefit from things like PG Bouncer and a vast extension catalog. Likewise, you could use that vast extension catalog to add very exciting functionality like cron jobs in your database, rather than using an external service. And you could even use the HTTP extension for things like webhooks. Once you've done that, you could also update your authentication module or provider that you're using to also issue Supabase compatible JSON web tokens. And these will let you work with row-level security without adopting the Supabase auth. So let's do some comparisons. First off, well, for all comparison, I will be comparing against Firebase, and we'll start off with database access control. So Supabase uses the row-level security, as we've talked about at length now, and it just gives you a nice, easy way to provide granular control over your data. Firebase uses a rules DSL, which is pretty powerful, but it can get pretty complex pretty fast, and it's only relevant on Firebase, or a Google Cloud Store if you're using that. If you choose to move away from Supabase, fortunately you can still use all that row-level security stuff you've implemented. However, if you did the same on Firebase, it's not going to work out as well. If we look here, we can see a really basic rules file for Firestore. And this one just works on posts, which could be for like a blog. And we want to allow everyone to read it. And then we want to allow you to create it, as long as your request says that you are the author. But for updates and deletes, we want to either allow the author or an admin to do so. Alright, so this is pretty okay, but as you can see, the update and delete rule is getting quite large. We had a few extra conditions there. It could be pretty unwieldy, pretty fast. And likewise, using this get thing, we're introspecting our database, which is fine, but having to do a few of those or some kind of filtering can get quite annoying. Now let's compare that to Supabase. So we would use row-level security, which is done via these policies. So we will allow anyone to read a post, and we just have to return a statement here that returns a true or false value. So in our case, anyone can read, so anyone can select. Then we want an author to be able to create, update, and delete their post. And we do that by checking if the logged in user with the auth.uid function is author_id. Then we want an admin to be able to update or delete any post. And we can do that by just seeing if the current user is an admin. And the benefit here is we're able to split out this logic rather than having an or statement, so it can live independently and scale as we need. So for storage access control, Supabase still uses row-level security, and it's pretty awesome because we can have really granular control over our files, while Firebase still uses rules, but it isn't as powerful as the Firestore rules, as it can't do as much with the database. If we wanted a more granular control, we could add custom claims to our access tokens in Firebase, but that is less than ideal, because then your JWTs will suddenly start getting larger and larger as you need more rules. For both, portability is about the same, so you don't really have to stress that much about vendor lock-in. I mean, after all, it's mostly blob storage. Let's have a look. So for our storage rules, we can do really basic things like allow users to read from a path that has their user ID or anything else that might be on their auth token. Whereas for a Supabase, we still have the same policies. So we're allowing everyone to read from our bucket using a policy. And then we're also allowing authors to create, update, and delete their media. We could also allow admins by having another policy that does a select one from users where they are an admin. And we could do things like have teams by seeing if the user is a member of a team, and then if the bucket starts with that team ID. So, responding to table events. This is a pretty big thing in backends as a service, the idea being that you can have triggers set up for when items are inserted or updated on a table, and then you can respond to those or perform other complex transformations or events afterwards. So Supabase does this natively using Postgres triggers. This is built into the database, and within these triggers you could write SQL, or you could use V8 or Python through extensions. Firebase uses cloud functions for this. They're a lot more powerful, to be honest, but with that power comes increased latency. So if your function takes a long time to complete, that means your throughput in your database is going to be slower. So if we look here, we can see a cloud function for a table event. In this case, we're doing something whenever the user is updated in the user's collection. So in this case, we're not doing anything. We do have a check here for if someone is an admin. We could do some assignments to the data and then update it. That way, our updates would be persisted to their change. And for the Postgres version, we are also not doing anything. But as you can see here, this trigger function can be a little bit hard to read, especially if you aren't as proficient at SQL. However, the Supabase platform sort of empowers you to go all in on SQL and understand your database as best as you can. So, Supabase in the wild. We've talked about it a lot, but who's actually using it? First up, we have MarkPrompt. It is built on top of the PG vector extension that I talked about earlier. It lets you store embeddings in Postgres that you can then use for natural language similarity search. This is already in use at a few moderate to large size companies, such as Cal.com, AngelList, and Replo. And this empowers you to query your documentation and ask it questions. It's really cool, and it helps with users and their frustrations as they try to find the information that they need. Next up, we have Base, built on top of Supabase and its SDKs, and it aims to give you a simple interface for interacting with your Postgres database. Quite often, we make an application and then we need to implement an admin panel, and that's where all the fun disappears. Base solves this by letting you create admin panels with the Notion-like UI. To stress work out of all of that and just makes it more enjoyable for developers. And then finally, we have Parquet. I want to say it's a business that was previously using Auth0 for all their users, and they migrated to Supabase just due to the cost savings that they could have, and this was notably as a swap from a B2B sort of system to a B2C. This is a German product, so I don't know as much about it. It looked to be pretty large last time I checked, but unfortunately I couldn't really say. So, Supabase and the community. Being open source, Supabase cares very much about its community. It's sort of the lifeblood, as people will be contributing to their open source repositories, as well as interacting with them on issues, pull requests, and forums. There is a very large Discord where people have all sorts of conversations and showcases. It's also where the Supabase hackathons are hosted, where users have a chance to go and build something on Supabase and win prizes. Likewise, the entire Supabase team is very active on Twitter. They have the meme machine manning the main Supabase account and posting some very spicy takes. And they also have a plethora of templates and example applications hosted on their website, as well as the Vercel templates page. This will include things like subscriptions for SaaSes, to just general setups and best practices with real-time, auth, and more. And so let's recap. Supabase is an open source backend as a service, similar to Firebase but without the proprietary bits. You can adopt Supabase at your own pace, starting with just using it as a managed database provider before moving into more advanced use cases. It enables you to build scalable applications on top of Postgres primitives and best practices, which helps you become a better database developer along the way. No more being scared of joins or anything of the such. True to its tagline, with a range of templates and examples as well as best practices, you can build your next idea in a weekend and scale to millions with just Postgres. So, this is where I would normally ask for questions, but unfortunately, this is recorded, so we're just going to have to skip over this. And where you can find me. So, I am starting to become more active on Twitter. I go under the handle listed above. I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I actually don't know how to. I made the username a long time ago and I don't really know what I was thinking. And on GitHub, I go by Mythy, and I'm usually just committing bad code, so probably don't look it over. With that, thank you for coming, and that is Supabase and how it is just Postgres and some APIs.